Moscow, July 17, 1944. The clock strikes 11 in the morning as the streets fall silent. There is no applause, no shouts of victory. Only the synchronized footsteps of 57,000 defeated German soldiers marching toward the heart of the Soviet capital. Among the crowd, one man carries neither a rifle nor a flag. He holds a camera. Military photographer Lev Wolfowitz receives direct orders from high command to record every face, every look, every shadow of that march. But a secret instruction accompanies the mission. Some images could never be shown to the public. Why? What was in those photographs that Stalin didn't want the world to see? And it's for these kinds of hidden details that this channel exists, to reveal the layers of history that most have never known. We're very close to reaching a historic subscriber milestone, and your subscription is what ensures that investigations like this continue to reach you. Think of it as part of a living archive. The more people join, the harder it becomes to bury these truths. Sign up now and be part of this collective effort to preserve the hidden memory of war. And in the comments, tell us which city or country you're watching from, so we can map together where this forgotten history is being heard. July 1944. The Red Army had just liberated Minsk, and the Soviet leadership was preparing a spectacle unlike any seen in modern warfare. At the center of this plan was not a general or a marshal, but a photographer. Lev Wolfowitz, a military cameraman attached to the Commissariat of Defense, received a direct summons from Moscow. His instructions were simple on paper, yet loaded with implication. He was to document the humiliation of captured German soldiers as they marched through the streets of the Soviet capital. Lev was no stranger to danger. He had covered frontline battles, witnessed burning villages in Ukraine, and stood among Soviet troops as artillery thundered over the Dnieper. But this assignment was different. It was not the chaos of combat he was being sent to capture. It was order, precision, and the deliberate choreography of defeat. Stalin did not want the world to see starving men broken by war. He wanted the disciplined lines of an enemy brought to heel. The photographs were meant to convey control, not chaos. For Lev, the secrecy surrounding his mission was striking. He was told not to speak of it, even to his closest colleagues. The official explanation was that the images would serve as evidence of victory. Yet, there were subtle instructions that puzzled him. He was warned not to photograph undignified weakness. No scenes of collapse, no images of Soviet guards mistreating prisoners. Every frame had to reinforce the idea that the Red Army had crushed the Wehrmacht with overwhelming strength, not with cruelty. Why such careful staging for men who were already defeated? That question haunted Lev as he prepared his equipment. His cameras had been calibrated, his lenses cleaned. He would be positioned along the central avenue of Tverskaya, with access points at multiple intersections. The regime wanted every angle covered, every expression recorded. And yet, behind the precision of the orders, Lev sensed unease. It was as if the authorities feared the images might reveal something they did not fully control. There is a little-known fact. Stalin himself had studied photographs of the German occupation of Kiev and Warsaw. He understood that images had the power to shape memory as much as military victories. The parade of the vanquished, as it would later be called, was therefore more than punishment. It was psychological warfare, not only against Berlin, but against Washington and London as well. But Lev could not ignore one final cryptic remark from his superior. "You may capture faces that will not appear in the newspapers. Some photographs will be for the archive only." He did not ask which faces or why they mattered. He would learn the answer only after the parade, and it would change everything about the way he understood his role in the war. Summer 1944. Europe was at a turning point. In the West, Allied troops had landed in Normandy, opening the long-awaited Second Front. In the East, the Soviet Union had launched Operation Bagration, one of the most devastating offensives in military history. Between June and August, the Red Army destroyed Germany's Army Group Center, inflicting nearly 350,000 casualties and erasing entire divisions from the Wehrmacht's order of battle. The balance of power on the Eastern Front had shifted irreversibly. For Joseph Stalin, the victory was not simply military, it was political theater on a continental stage. The Soviet leader had two audiences in mind: Berlin, which he wanted to humiliate, and the Western Allies, whom he wanted to intimidate. Operation Bagration coincided deliberately with the Normandy invasion. It sent a clear signal that the Red Army was not only holding the Eastern Front, but advancing with unstoppable momentum. The Soviet Union was no longer the desperate defender of 1941. It had become the spearhead that would decide the fate of Europe. The destruction of Army Group Center was catastrophic for Hitler. He had believed that his main threat in 1944 would come from the West, forcing him to divert panzers and air units to France. By the time Soviet forces advanced across Belarus, the German high command was stretched thin and unable to regroup. In less than 2 weeks, the Red Army liberated Minsk, opening the road to Warsaw and further west. Soviet propaganda described the offensive as a second Stalingrad, and in some respects, it was worse for Germany. At Stalingrad, 91,000 soldiers had been captured. In Belarus, the figure exceeded 150,000. But Stalin wanted more than battlefield reports. He wanted a visible demonstration that German power had been broken. The decision to parade prisoners of war through Moscow was modeled on the triumphs of ancient Rome, where defeated enemies were marched before citizens to prove the empire's supremacy. Yet in this modern version, the goal was not only to shame the defeated, but also to prepare Soviet citizens for the sacrifices still ahead. The war was not over, and Stalin needed his people convinced that victory was inevitable. Still, there was a hidden layer beneath the spectacle. The Western Allies had long feared that Soviet advances would extend beyond defeating Germany into establishing dominance over Eastern Europe. A mass display of captured German soldiers in Moscow was not only humiliation for Hitler, it was a subtle warning to London and Washington. The Soviets were not merely fighting, they were reshaping the post-war map. What many forget is that Stalin personally reviewed the plan for the parade. He approved the numbers, the routes, even the timing down to the hour. He wanted the world to see a disciplined procession of German defeat, not the chaos of broken men. This level of control hinted that the event carried more meaning than simple propaganda. And that is where Lev Wolfovich's role becomes so intriguing. He was not just recording history. He was documenting a calculated performance staged for multiple audiences at once. What his camera captured was both the surface message of Soviet strength and something far less obvious, something never meant for the public eye. The real question is, if Stalin wanted to show absolute control, why were certain images ordered to disappear from the official record? That detail brings us directly to the photographer himself and the secret instructions he carried into the streets of Moscow. On the morning of July 17, 1944, the streets of Moscow were heavy with silence. More than 120,000 civilians had lined the avenues, waiting for a spectacle that none of them had been warned about until that very day. Among the crowd, blending into the uniformity of Soviet officials and military escorts, stood Lev Wolfovich, the war photographer whose lens would preserve and censor the most humiliating moment in the life of the German army. His orders were clear: capture the march of 57,000 prisoners, but ensure that the images showed order, dignity of Soviet control, and absolute defeat of the enemy. Lev's position was not accidental. He had been carefully placed at vantage points along Tverskaya Street and near Mayakovsky Square, locations chosen for their ability to frame both the prisoners and the mass of silent Soviet citizens. But he carried more than cameras and film. In his pocket were sealed instructions from the Moscow Military District Command, detailing exactly which scenes were to be documented and which were to be avoided. A fallen German soldier, a prisoner stumbling from exhaustion, or even a hostile look from the crowd. These were images that could never leave his negatives. The paradox of Lev's mission was striking. He was sent to document reality, yet his role was to edit reality in real time. Soviet propaganda demanded images that would circulate in Pravda and later in newsreels abroad, showing disciplined rows of German captives, generals with medals still pinned to their chests, and Moscow standing as witness to their downfall. But what Lev saw through his lens was something else. The human erosion of an army once feared as invincible. The sharp contrast between the official narrative and the truth unfolding on the pavement became his silent burden. To avoid suspicion, Lev had to work in plain sight. He walked alongside the formations, clicking his shutter while NKVD officers monitored both him and the prisoners. His camera, a Soviet-made Fed rangefinder modeled after the Leica, carried a limited number of rolls. Each frame had to be chosen carefully, not just for technical quality, but for political weight. He knew that a single misstep, a shot that revealed too much of the Germans' misery, or worse, a hint of Soviet unease, could be interpreted as sabotage. And in Stalin's Moscow, sabotage was a death sentence. What makes Lev's account so unique is not only what he photographed, but what he was forced to destroy. Official archives confirm that after the parade, a significant portion of captured negatives was ordered to be burned. Yet Lev hinted years later in private letters that some images survived, hidden in sealed envelopes, entrusted to friends outside Moscow. This raises the question: what exactly was on those forbidden frames? The silence of the crowd? The moment a Soviet citizen dared to spit at a German officer? Or perhaps something far more dangerous to the myth of absolute Soviet control? Lev's invisible presence reminds us of the precarious line between truth and narrative in wartime. His lens recorded not only the prisoners, but the system that dictated how history would be remembered. He became, unintentionally, both a servant of propaganda and a witness against it. The photographs that survived in the public domain show a spectacle of triumph. The ones that vanished may have told a story of fragility, contradiction, and human complexity. And this brings us to the heart of the mystery. If Lev risked preserving even a fragment of what was forbidden, then somewhere, hidden away from official history, exists a version of that day that we were never meant to see. The question is, did he succeed in keeping those shadows of the parade alive? Or were they erased forever by the very system he served? The date was July 17, 1944. At exactly 11 a.m., the gates opened at Moscow's Hippodrome, and tens of thousands of German prisoners began their forced procession into the Soviet capital. They marched in columns of 600 men each, filling the wide arteries of the city with the sound of synchronized boots striking the pavement. The crowd, numbering well over 100,000, stood in silence. There were no cheers of triumph, no chants of revenge, only the steady rhythm of defeat moving through the streets. The spectacle was deliberate. Nearly 600 soldiers of the Wehrmacht, captured during Operation Bagration, had been carefully selected for the parade. They were not the starved and broken remnants often seen in the aftermath of encirclements. Instead, Soviet authorities ensured that these men had been fed, shaved, and placed in clean uniforms. The goal was not to show collapse, but to display an enemy still intact, and yet utterly powerless before Soviet might. This choice was not accidental. Stalin wanted the image of Germany's best troops, stripped of their weapons, walking like shadows of their former strength. At the front of the procession were generals and officers, some still wearing the decorations of campaigns that had once terrorized Europe. Behind them stretched endless rows of infantrymen, artillery crews, and tank units. The march extended for hours, an unbroken line of captured soldiers passing through Moscow's central boulevards. Onlookers whispered that the number of prisoners seemed infinite, as if the German army itself was dissolving into the streets of the Soviet Union. And in a way, it was. This was the public dismantling of Hitler's war machine. One of the most striking details of the parade came at its conclusion. Immediately after the last prisoner passed, water trucks rolled forward, washing the pavement clean. The symbolism was unmistakable. The streets of Moscow would not retain even the footprints of the enemy. What had just occurred was not simply a military display, but a ritual of purification designed to erase the presence of Germany from the heart of the Soviet state. Yet beneath the controlled choreography, there were signs that the event carried more than propaganda. Eyewitness accounts reveal that certain formations of prisoners looked oddly composed, even defiant. Some officers held their heads high, refusing to appear broken. One man in particular, General Vincenz Müller, was said to have walked with a calm expression that unsettled even those photographing him. Who was Müller? And why did his presence seem so out of place in a march designed to showcase humiliation? Lev Wolfovich, stationed along Tverskaya Street with his camera, noticed these details. Through his lens, he caught glimpses of faces that did not match the official narrative. While most soldiers looked weary and hollow, a few carried an expression that suggested something different: knowledge, perhaps, or expectation. Lev could not yet know it, but among those thousands, there were men whose roles extended far beyond surrender. Their stories, later hidden or erased, would complicate the meaning of the entire parade. The March of the Vanquished became a defining moment of the Soviet war effort. Western newspapers reported on it with fascination, and Nazi propaganda dismissed it as fabrication, claiming that the photographs were staged. But the event was real, and its implications were profound. It was both a celebration and a warning, a reminder that the Red Army could dismantle the Wehrmacht not only on the battlefield, but in the symbolic heart of Moscow. And yet, the real significance of that day was not fully visible to the crowd. It was hidden in the faces that stood out, in the fragments of film that never appeared in Soviet newspapers, and in the orders given to Lev about which images were to vanish into the archives. Among them was the photograph of Müller, a man whose story would connect this spectacle to something much deeper, something far more dangerous than the humiliation of defeated soldiers. As the endless columns of German soldiers moved through Moscow, the crowd's eyes naturally searched for familiar figures. Among the officers, a tall man with sharp features and a composed expression drew particular attention. His name was General Vincenz Müller, a veteran of the Eastern Front and a commander who had fought fiercely against Soviet forces in Ukraine and Belarus. Unlike many of the other officers, Müller walked with a posture that seemed to resist humiliation. He did not appear broken. He looked, instead, like a man who had already accepted a new role waiting for him. Müller's presence in the parade was not accidental. Only weeks earlier, he had been captured during the collapse of Army Group Center in Operation Bagration. But unlike countless other generals who fell into Soviet hands, Müller was treated differently. Reports in Soviet archives suggest he was quickly separated from other officers, interrogated by NKVD officials, and later invited to join a political project. Within months, He would emerge as one of the founding members of the National Committee for a Free Germany, a Soviet-backed organization of captured officers and exiles designed to undermine Nazi authority. His march through Moscow, therefore, was not simply the walk of a defeated general. It was a prelude to a propaganda weapon Stalin was quietly constructing. Lev Wolfowitz, observing through his lens, sensed that Müller's demeanor was not that of an ordinary prisoner. His stride was steady, his face calm, and his gaze seemed less directed at the ground than at the crowd itself. In Lev's photographs, Müller appeared distinct from the faceless mass behind him. This was a man whose survival had value. But here lies the crucial detail. The public saw only a general among thousands. The Kremlin saw something different, a tool to fracture German morale and a bargaining chip for the post-war order. Müller was not the only such figure. Among the officers in the parade were men with potential intelligence value, engineers familiar with German military technology, staff officers who had handled maps of the Eastern Front, and even administrators from occupied territories. Each of them was catalogued, photographed, and assessed. The parade was not only humiliation, it was also reconnaissance in plain sight, a way for the Soviets to signal to their own people and to foreign observers that they held not just prisoners, but knowledge, secrets, and leverage. The hidden faces of the parade reveal a layer of strategy rarely discussed. On the surface, the event looked like retribution for 3 years of German invasion. But behind the stagecraft, the NKVD and Soviet intelligence were already laying foundations for what would later become the East German state. Men like Müller were part of that calculation. By 1949, he would serve as Chief of Staff of the East German Army, an astonishing transformation for a man once paraded as a symbol of defeat. It means that in those few hours in Moscow, the Soviets were not only burying the past, they were planting seeds for the future. Lev's camera may have captured these faces, but not all of them survived in the public archive. Orders were given to suppress images that drew too much attention to figures of future importance. Officially, the photographs showed an anonymous tide of German soldiers, all equally humiliated. Unofficially, Soviet censors made sure that the men chosen for political roles would not be remembered as prisoners. They would be reborn as allies, collaborators, or instruments of Soviet influence. This duality, the spectacle of humiliation masking the quiet selection of valuable prisoners, was perhaps the most dangerous secret of the parade. The public saw Germany broken. Stalin's inner circle saw Germany's future reshaped. Lev, unknowingly, had recorded fragments of both stories. And in time, he would discover just how carefully those fragments had been controlled. But there is one more element that complicates this narrative. If Müller and others were already marked for political use, why parade them at all? Why expose future collaborators to a display of defeat? The answer lies in the delicate balance Stalin had to maintain between spectacle, secrecy, and strategy. And that contradiction would become clear only in the weeks that followed. In the Kremlin, behind closed doors, Joseph Stalin reviewed the reports of the parade with the same precision he applied to troop movements. For him, July 17th was not merely about shaming Germany. It was an operation with overlapping objectives: psychological warfare against Berlin, reassurance and intimidation directed at his own citizens, and a carefully veiled message to the Western allies. Every step of those 57,000 prisoners had been calibrated for maximum effect. Stalin understood that the Soviet Union, despite its victories, remained exhausted. Operation Bagration had been a triumph, but it had cost nearly 500,000 Soviet casualties in a matter of weeks. The population had endured 3 years of brutal war, famine, and displacement. To sustain morale, Stalin needed proof that sacrifice was yielding results. The silent march of German soldiers through Moscow provided exactly that. A living monument of revenge without a single shot fired. It told the Soviet people, "Your suffering has broken the enemy." Yet the parade also served a second audience, London and Washington. Only weeks earlier, Churchill had written in his diary that he feared Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe after the war. Roosevelt's advisors had expressed similar concerns. By showcasing tens of thousands of captured Germans, Stalin was sending an unmistakable signal. The Soviet Union was not only winning, it was dictating the terms of Europe's future. The Allies would need to consider carefully just how much influence they could exert in post-war negotiations when the Red Army controlled the continent's center. There was also a hidden domestic calculation. Stalin had long feared the corrosive effects of German propaganda. The Wehrmacht had invaded the Soviet Union under the banner of superiority, portraying Slavs as subhuman. The parade inverted that narrative. By showing Germans under Soviet guard, Stalin shattered the myth of German invincibility and rewrote the hierarchy of power. This was not just humiliation, it was ideological retribution. The same society once called Untermenschen now marched the so-called master race through its capital like cattle. But Stalin's thinking extended beyond morale and messaging. The presence of figures like General Vincenz Müller suggested a deeper game. The Soviets had no intention of wasting every captured officer in labor camps. Some were already being groomed for political use in Germany's future, as collaborators in what would later become East Germany. This duality, humiliation in public, cultivation in private, reflected Stalin's mastery of contradiction. The same man paraded before Soviet citizens as a defeated enemy could, months later, be presented as a comrade in the struggle against fascism. One more layer complicates Stalin's calculations: the silence of the crowd. Contemporary reports confirm that Moscow's citizens did not cheer or jeer. They watched in cold quiet, almost funereal. Stalin had ordered it that way. He feared uncontrolled emotion might spark violence, and violence might turn prisoners into martyrs. Instead, the silence was choreographed to amplify the weight of the spectacle. The sound of boots on the pavement, uninterrupted by shouting, created an atmosphere of inevitability, the sense that history itself was marching forward. And here lies the paradox. Stalin staged the event as an assertion of absolute control, but in doing so, he revealed his own anxieties. Why did he need such careful orchestration if the Soviet position was truly secure? Why erase certain photographs, suppress particular images, and control every detail of a parade whose message seemed self-evident? Perhaps because beneath the triumph, Stalin knew the war was not yet won, and that the alliances holding the world together were as fragile as the momentary silence in Moscow that day. The next phase of the story will expose how that fragility translated into ruthless choices about the fate of the prisoners themselves. For while some, like Müller, were elevated to future positions of influence, the vast majority faced a very different destiny, one that would never appear in the photographs published in Pravda. When the last water trucks washed away the dust of the German march, Moscow's streets returned to their daily rhythm. But for the prisoners, the parade was not an end. It was only a prelude. Within hours, most of the 57,000 men were divided into groups and escorted to rail stations under NKVD supervision. Their destination was not public squares or propaganda offices, but the sprawling network of labor camps scattered across the Soviet Union. The Soviet system of handling prisoners of war was vast and ruthless. According to official records, more than 3 million German soldiers were captured on the Eastern Front during the war. By 1945, at least a third of them had perished in captivity. The men who had marched through Moscow now faced years of forced labor in mines, forests, and construction sites stretching from the Urals to Siberia. For many, survival depended less on strength than on chance. Food was scarce, disease spread quickly, and the harsh climate made every winter a test of endurance. Yet the treatment of prisoners was not uniform. Officers and men with specialized skills, engineers, doctors, administrators, were often separated from the general population and interrogated for information. Some were quietly absorbed into Soviet projects, contributing knowledge about German technology or logistics. Others, like Müller, were groomed for political purposes, introduced into organizations such as the National Committee for a Free Germany. For the average soldier, however, there was no such reprieve. The vast majority became anonymous laborers in an empire built on punishment and survival. One stark example illustrates the dual reality of Soviet captivity. In 1949, while Müller was already serving in political positions aligned with Soviet interests, thousands of his fellow captives remained in Siberian camps. Some would not be released until a decade later, after Adenauer's 1955 negotiations with Khrushchev. For these men, the war did not end in 1945. Their personal front line continued in the frozen barracks of the Gulag system, a silent war of attrition far from the headlines of Nuremberg or Berlin's reconstruction. Lev Wolfowitz, meanwhile, processed the photographs of the parade under strict supervision. Many images were approved for publication, appearing in Soviet newspapers and international press agencies. Others, particularly those showing defiant officers or recognizable figures like Müller, were confiscated for archival purposes. Lev could not help but wonder what became of the men whose faces he had captured. The state told the public one version of their fate: humiliation and erasure. But Lev suspected there was another, more complex story playing out in the shadows. Here lies the unsettling contradiction. The parade was meant to show Soviet justice, but justice was never the true goal. The prisoners were pawns in a larger strategy, divided between expendable labor and potential instruments of influence. Some would vanish nameless into frozen camps, while a few would re-emerge as pillars of the new East German state. Both outcomes served Stalin's purposes, but neither matched the narrative given to the Soviet public. And this leads us to a critical turning point. If the fate of the prisoners was so carefully controlled, who controlled the story itself? Who decided which images would define the event and which would vanish into hidden archives? To answer that, we must look not at the soldiers in the parade, but at the man behind the camera, and at what his photographs revealed and concealed. Late in the evening of July 17th, after the parade had ended and the last rolls of film had been delivered to the editorial office of Pravda, Lev Wolfowitz returned to his darkroom. Officially, his task was finished. Select the approved negatives, deliver them for publication, and destroy the rest. But Lev did not obey that last instruction. Instead, he carefully set aside a small box, hidden behind stacks of chemical trays, where he stored copies of photographs that were never meant to be seen again. Among these forbidden images were close-up portraits of prisoners who showed no sign of defeat. One negative captured General Vincent Müller lifting his chin defiantly as he passed the reviewing stand. Another showed a group of younger Wehrmacht soldiers exchanging brief glances, almost as if they were organizing silently within the column. These were not the broken figures that Soviet propaganda wanted to project. They were dangerous images, reminders that even in humiliation, an enemy could still appear resilient. Lev's decision to keep them was reckless. The NKVD routinely inspected photographers' work, and possession of unauthorized negatives was a crime that could lead to imprisonment or worse. But Lev had already convinced himself that history demanded a more complete record than the one Stalin allowed. Perhaps it was instinct, or perhaps it was his quiet rebellion against the suffocating control of Soviet censorship. Whatever the reason, his secret archive began to grow role by role, developing into an invisible counter-narrative of the war. The significance of these hidden photographs became clear years later. After the war, some of the very officers Lev had captured, including Müller, reappeared in political roles in the Soviet zone of Germany. The official press portrayed them as redeemed collaborators who had abandoned Hitler. But Lev's photos told a different story. They showed that on the day of the parade, these men were anything but broken. Instead of defeated enemies, they looked like figures being repositioned for a new role in Europe's balance of power. This raises a troubling possibility. Was the parade truly designed to humiliate Germany? Or was it, at least in part, a recruitment mechanism in disguise? Stalin may have already been thinking about the post-war order. By parading captured officers through Moscow, he could demonstrate Soviet dominance while quietly identifying which among them could be turned into future allies. Lev's lens had caught the contradiction. Men who were officially enemies, but unofficially candidates for Soviet political projects. The mini-climax came in 1948, when Lev discovered that one of his hidden negatives, showing Müller's defiant expression, had been stolen from his archive. He never learned who took it, but within months, the image surfaced in an internal NKVD dossier, marked restricted circulation. Someone had known about his secret collection. Lev's private rebellion was no longer safe. The very act of preserving truth had placed him under suspicion. And here lies the tension that still lingers decades later. Lev's photographs challenge the official narrative of July 17, 1944. They suggest that the parade was not only a theatrical humiliation, but also a carefully managed experiment in power, testing both the loyalty of Soviet citizens and the malleability of German prisoners. Yet most of these images never reached the public. They remained locked in archives, hidden behind classified labels, or quietly destroyed. The final question is this: if a single photographer could capture a version of history that contradicted Stalin's script, how many other fragments of truth were erased before they ever reached the public eye? And more importantly, what else was concealed in the years when victory parades became blueprints for the world order to come? Moscow, July 17, 1944. As the last prisoner columns disappeared into the holding camps and the streets of the capital were washed clean of the dust and sweat of 70,000 men, the Soviet press hailed the parade of the vanquished as a triumph of justice. For Stalin, it was presented as the visible proof that the Reich had been broken and that the Red Army was not only the defender of the motherland, but the future arbiter of Europe. Yet, the deeper consequences of that single day would unfold not in the cheers of the crowd, but in the shadows of diplomacy, espionage, and memory. In the months that followed, the official photographs were published across the Soviet Union and even distributed abroad. They showed endless ranks of German prisoners, their heads bowed, watched over by a victorious Soviet population. But what the world never saw, the faces that Lev Wolfowitz secretly preserved, told another story. These hidden negatives revealed prisoners who still carried an air of resolve, men who would later resurface as political actors in the Soviet occupation zone. The parade, in this sense, was not only about spectacle. It was a stage where Stalin tested which Germans could be broken and which could be bent into new roles. The ripple effects were profound. In the years after 1945, as East Germany took shape under Soviet control, former Wehrmacht officers like General Vinzenz Müller played roles in building the very structures meant to resist Western influence. This paradox, that men paraded as symbols of humiliation would later stand as pillars of a Soviet-aligned state, underscores the deeper logic of the event. What appeared to be the final humiliation of Nazi Germany was simultaneously the opening act of the Cold War. For the Soviet people, however, the legacy was different. The images of that day reinforced the belief that their suffering had meaning, that their sacrifices on the battlefield had delivered not only survival, but dominance. The trauma of invasion was answered by the sight of the invader brought low in chains of discipline. And yet, hidden beneath the surface, a more troubling truth remained. The Soviet state had carefully edited the memory of the war, shaping it into a weapon as powerful as any tank or artillery barrage. Lev Wolfovich's private archive stands as a silent challenge to that official memory. His secret photographs remind us that history is never only what is published, but also what is concealed. Stalin's calculated performance on July 17, 1944, succeeded in impressing the Allies, intimidating Germany, and reinforcing Soviet unity. But it also set a precedent: the manipulation of imagery as an instrument of statecraft, a pattern that would echo through decades of Cold War propaganda. And so, the march of 70,000 prisoners through Moscow becomes more than a historical episode. It is a reminder that power lies not only in the victories of armies, but in the control of memory. The parade ended in a single day, but its images, both the ones the world saw and the ones it never did, shaped the future of Europe in ways few could have imagined at the time. In the end, perhaps the most haunting question is the one left unanswered. If one photographer could capture fragments of truth that contradicted Stalin's narrative, how many other truths were buried beneath the parades, the speeches, and the carefully staged triumphs of the 20th century? History remembers what it is allowed to remember. But the shadows of that July afternoon remind us that beneath every spectacle of power lies another story, waiting for the moment when someone dares to bring it to light. Final line: the victors wrote their version of July 17, 1944. But the hidden negatives whisper that victory itself may have been another kind of illusion.